Overnight, more than 40 national nuclear societies from around the world have signed on to a Nuclear for Climate declaration. Meeting at the 2015 International Congress on Advances in Nuclear Power Plants in Nice, the declaration commits the nuclear scientists to limiting global warming to 2 degrees by 2050. That's regarded by most as being the safe level of climate change, and it's the same goal that will be on the table at Paris later this year at the UN climate talks, as nations seek agreement on a new post-2020 global climate agreement. But top US climate scientist James Hansen says the goal is a nonsense and the world is on the wrong track, thinking that 2 degrees of warming is safe. James Hansen is adjunct professor at the Columbia University Earth Institute. In 2013, he retired as head of the Goddard Institute for Space Studies in New York City after 46 years with NASA. James Hansen joins us from Nice in France, and he's just spoken at the ICAP Nuclear Congress. James Hansen, welcome back to RM Breakfast.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Now, James Hansen, you've long been a supporter of nuclear power because it can significantly limit global carbon emissions, but you're refusing to sign this Nuclear for Climate declaration. Why is that?
No, someone's misinformed you. What I refused to sign was the Vatican declaration, which had the 2-degree limit. And the reason I don't sign that is that 2 degrees is actually a prescription for disaster. That's actually well understood by the scientific community. We know that the prior interglacial period, about 120,000 years ago, it's called the Eemian in Europe, but it was less than 2 degrees Celsius warmer than pre-industrial conditions, and sea level was at least 6 to 8 meters higher. So it's crazy to think that 2 degrees Celsius is a safe limit. The only thing you can argue is that, well, it might take a while for the sea level to rise that much. But we know that it would happen because once the fossil fuels are burned to reach that level, they are not taken out of the systems for millennia, and it does not require millennia for the ice sheets to disintegrate.
So can just take it back a bit here. If you say you'd be crazy to be shooting for 2 degrees, that is exactly what we are going to be shooting for in Paris at the global climate talks, isn't it?
Yeah, and that number was chosen because it was convenient. And thought that, well, that'll give us a few decades so we can set targets for the middle of the century. Actually, what the science tells us is that we have an emergency. This is actually a global crisis, and the science for that is crystal clear. It's not obvious to the public because the climate system responds slowly. The ocean is 4 kilometers deep. These ice sheets are 3 kilometers thick. They only respond over timescales of decades to centuries. But once the processes are started, it's going to be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to stop them. So what the science actually tells us is that we should reduce emissions as fast as practical, bearing in mind the economic consequences. But in fact, the actions that are needed are not economically harmful. You just have to make the prices of fossil fuels honest.
I'll come back to that in a moment. I just want to stay with reducing emissions as fast as practical. Is that why generally the global community, including, as I say, on the table in Paris, is looking at 2 degrees because that's what's practical? But can you spell out...
That's what they argue, yes. That's what they would argue. But they're talking about ways of doing it which are extremely ineffectual. Like the Kyoto Protocol, this cap-and-trade with offsets. It is very ineffectual. What you actually need to do is make the price of fossil fuels honest instead of subsidizing them. It's been shown with economic studies that if you add a gradually rising fee to carbon, collect it from fossil fuel companies at the source, the domestic mine or the port of entry, and distribute that money 100% to the public, an equal amount to all legal residents, it will actually spur the economy and increase the gross national product and allow you to phase down emissions much more rapidly than with the screwy cap and trade with offset schemes.
So you're saying that's a much simpler kind of system than cap and trade, or the system that Australia had in place there for a while?
A system that's designed for the public, not for special interests. In the United States, we had a bill introduced, 3,500 pages of giveaways to every special interest that could lobby Congress and get its favorite thing in there. But that's not what you need. You need a simple, honest system, which would require only 1 or 2 pages. But that's what politicians have not come up with yet.
But it seems like, you're right, that's what politicians haven't come up with. But as I say, the scientists, as I understand it, the IPCC, they're still talking about a 2% reduction too. That's what they're doing their modelling on. And the assessment report 5, which came out of the IPCC, last year predicted sea levels would rise between 26 and 82 centimetres by the end of this century. You're actually saying it will rise much more than that, aren't you, and even more quickly?
Yeah, that's right. And that is one disagreement. The paleoclimate evidence indicates that ice sheets are much more sensitive than the glaciologists, the modelers of ice sheets had indicated. And furthermore, we now have satellite data that confirms that. We have data over the last 12 years that confirms that ice sheet disintegration is a nonlinear process. That should not have been surprising, and I've been saying that for 10 years. But now the satellite data confirms that the ice sheets are losing mass faster and faster with a doubling time of about 10 years. If that continues, we would get sea level rise of several meters within 40 to 50 years. So we really do not want to continue to force the system at the rate that we are now.
So just spell that out for us, James, before we move on. Sea level rises of several metres per 40 years. What would that look like in terms of our lives?
The consequences are almost unthinkable. It would mean that all coastal cities would become dysfunctional. Some parts of the cities would still be sticking above the water, but they would not be habitable. So that's the economic implications are incalculable. So we really cannot go down that path. This is an issue of intergenerational injustice where it's a moral issue because the current generation is burning the fossil fuels, getting the benefits, and creating a situation that for young people, our children and grandchildren and future generations is going to have enormous consequences.
It's 6:20 on Breakfast. We're joined by Dr. James Hansen, climate scientist, leading climate scientist, former head of the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies in New York City. James Hansen, a report from the UK Grantham Institute this week makes it clear that based on current pledges and targets, the world's not even close to delivering on the 2 degrees goal, which you say is not enough. Does that mean we need to be looking elsewhere, seriously, at some sort of negative emissions technology, drawing down atmospheric or ocean carbon? What might that technology be? Is the answer nuclear? You're currently at a nuclear conference. I mean, is there an emergency here that requires a different way of thinking?
I hate to sound like I'm disagreeing with all the scientists, but that's not true, that we are necessarily beyond 2 degrees. We could actually come in well under 2 degrees, but it does require beginning to phase down fossil fuel emissions, and that requires 2 things. The most fundamental is making the price of fossil fuels honest, and that would encourage alternatives. But those alternatives are going to have to include technological advances, and that You mentioned that I'd been supporting nuclear power for decades or something. That's not actually true. It's only in the last several years that, as I've begun to look at the energy situation and see what is actually happening. You hear all this stuff about, renewables, solar panels are becoming very cheap and they're taking over. Well, in fact, non-hydro renewables are providing only 3% of the energy, even though they've been subsidized heavily for several decades. So they're an important part of the solution, but not an adequate part. Nuclear power is the one thing that could help give us carbon-free electricity. And if we get carbon-free electricity, as Sweden has right now, then the problem can be solved quickly. The only thing that would be required in addition is liquid fuels, but you can make non-fossil fuel liquid fuels, but you can do that with energy from electricity. So if we have carbon-free electricity, the problem is solved. And that's a doable thing, but it does require the technology development as well as a rising fee on fossil fuels.
And can I just ask you finally and briefly, we're almost out of time, but as you say, you've been sounding this alarm for a long time now, and many others have too, but for some years there, it just sort of, the whole argument descended into a debate between the so-called climate skeptics and the so-called, global warmists. What do you think about, are we through that yet? And where do you think the voice of the skeptics versus the others?
That was never real. That was on the surface appeared to be what was happening. But in reality, the contrarians were representing the conservative side who felt that liberals are going to use this as a method to raise taxes and to increase control over their lives. And that's exactly what they do not want. And I don't blame them. But so they were simply denying the science because they didn't want those political consequences. It didn't really have much to do with science, and it still doesn't. And we really need to get the conservatives to understand the situation because they need to be part of the solution, and I think they will be, but it needs to happen pretty quickly.
James Hansen, I appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
Dr. James Hansen is a climate scientist, as I mentioned, former head of the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies in New York City, and these days is adjunct professor in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences at Columbia University.